How often do we get an opportunity to discuss what is a university for? So all of us here are presumably studying, teaching, working within these institutions, and yet it's not the first question that is often thrown at us. What is the point of a university? My starting point, how am I going to do this in 5 minutes? But my starting point is that there is a big contradiction at the heart of that question of what a university is for, because I think it is an institution that is absolutely caught between its relationship to the social and economic reproduction of privilege on the one hand, and on the other hand, its capacity to generate some kind of resistance to that process. Now that is a very crude way of actually just showing us how complex, or how changing as well, how fluid the situation of what is a university for is. That it is obviously plays a crucial role in all sorts of forms of social reproduction, and yet, because I think for many of us, that's probably one of the attractions of it, there is a germ of the possibility of questioning that process itself from within the institutions. Now that is not a new contradiction at all. I was privileged enough to have a PhD student from Spain who is, it's a pretty ambitious project. He's looking at the history, 800 years of the idea of the university in one thesis. So he's quite an ambitious guy. But he was attracted to come and study for a bit at Goldsmiths, you know, partly because of what happened in 2010, 2011, and the defence of the public university, and wanted a bit of an education in the UK. But he was, you know, he's got a fascinating history of this contradiction. One of the things he was telling me about was a group called the Goldsmiths. Has anyone heard of them? From the 12th and 13th century. These are a bunch, effectively, of wandering students and scholars across Central Europe and France in particular. And they were a sort of oppositional intellectual movement who directly challenged the Catholic authorities to the extent that they were, after a while, banned from campuses across Europe because they wanted universities to be places which were based on merit and free thinking and not on the privileges and on the power of the nobility. So it was, you know, even then there was a sharp, if for them quite a painful reminder of who actually had the power. That debate started back in the 12th, 13th century, and it is still a debate that I think we should be having now. I guess the Goldsmiths, for me, were the sort of an early version of the Millbank generation from a couple of years ago as well. So this is a debate that we should keep resurrecting. Now, of course, from 1200 up till now, there's been a few different iterations of that particular debate, and we've had a few quite important developments. The kind of thing he does in his huge chronology. You know, you have to somehow then deal with the Enlightenment, somehow deal with the Industrial Revolution, the mass university system we've seen more recently, right up to the present day, and the way in which the question is or is not put about the idea of the university in the most recent white paper on higher education, which, just to get a sort of flavour of how it's urging us to think about what a university is for, that white paper has 16 mentions of competition, 14 mentions of innovation, and not a single mention in its 100 pages on ideas, thought, reflection, or discovery. I swear, I'm boring enough to actually gone through and counted the lack of references to what you might think should be the heart of any vision of the university today, or maybe you are not at all surprised. Now, one way of doing this, and I thought it was interesting what Peter Scott said in the previous session. He said that often us lot in this room are accused of being the conservatives, and it is those who seek to marketise education are the more radical reformers. Well, I don't think that means we shouldn't go back in history either. And there's lots of very interesting things to pick up in this debate about what a university is, because actually struggling for that now is not about resurrecting a golden age. Struggling for what we think might be a useful vision of a public university in the contemporary circumstances is a huge challenge, and that does not mark us out as conservatives in any way. So the fact that we have one of the major statements on higher education in Britain came out exactly 50 years ago, the Robbins Report to Higher Education, and without going into its, you know, all the different elements of it, it's just interesting to consider the way in which he was discussing it as compared to what we hear today. one of the things is that Lord Robbins, in the official government report into higher education, did talk about that university should be a place where you learn skills to, as he puts it, play a part in the general division of labour. That's a kind of, that's something quite familiar to us today, I would suggest. But he also used very old-fashioned phrases, which I still think are worth, all right, modernising, but fighting for in the context of the challenges we face today. It would be useful. Another one, that universities are, this is his phrase, one of their aims is to promote the general powers of the mind, to produce not mere specialists, but rather cultivated men and women, like we have in this room. Even where it is concerned with practical techniques, it imparts themes on a plane of generality that makes possible their application to many problems. So it's not just about learning one skill for the sake of it. It's about getting a general understanding of the world. It's also, what old-fashioned phrase this is, search for truth and the nature of discovery. It's about the transmission of a common culture and standards of citizenship. And then very interestingly for today as well, where we have so much of what we're facing now is a kind of standardization, but of course it's a tiered standardization because there are these different hierarchies within British universities, but within those there is a real a pressure on standardization. And Newman said 50 years ago that existing institutions must be free to experiment in their organizational forms without any predetermined limitations. And he spoke of the scope for individual and institutional initiative that he argued was key to the intellectual development of the students. Imagine your vice-chancellors saying that now. Actually, we need constantly to be different. We need to be free to experiment because that's what's good for our students. So that's why whatever the Downing Street is telling me, whatever the department is telling me to do now, we refuse that. Imagine if they had that kind of approach to some of the edicts that are handed down. So I think that's, it's worth thinking back to those sorts of debate. Of course, there are all sorts of contemporary debate. One very quick way of doing this is to look in the journal. It's freely available, which is a rarity, in the latest issue of the journal Sociology, where there's a little debate around Stephen Collini's book on what are universities for. So first of all, that's not a bad place to go to start. But there are 4 reviews of the book which throw up some interesting ideas, one of which is from John Holmwood, who's speaking here, who argues that universities are for, quote, providing space for reflections on complexity and uncertainty. Universities are about providing space for reflections on complexity and uncertainty. To me, that is another way, I completely agree with him, that's a way of saying that universities are places where you should encourage thinking. Now, I don't know if that speaks to the kinds of work that you're able to do in your own institution as well. That thinking seems to me to be pretty important as the root of an idea of a university. Of course, thinking is the precondition for lots of other things, including, I guess, more thinking, more questioning, more creating, more synthesizing, even the precondition for doing things as well. So I don't know, I don't want to polarize things unhelpfully, but I do think when we have this discussion now, I'm going to shut up in a second, you might say we are presented with 2 horrifically polarized conceptions of what the university is for. There is increasingly the privatized vision of the university. It's a site of competition. It's a site of economic value, instrumental reason, corporate research, more and more of profit, of efficiency, a privatized thought. An example that's close to my heart, recent from last week actually, they're also sites of unfree labour. I won't name the universities, but this is the kind of thing that just staggers me, makes me want to come to conferences like this to make sure that we change this, that one unnamed institute, a lecturer from one unnamed institution applied for a job at another unnamed institution, was offered the job in time for the REF, this was last month, to start in September, and the host institution, where the person was, not only refused to allow this academic to move, but threatened to sue the academic, as well as the institution that wanted to hire him. Lawsuits on both houses. I mean, this is where we have, I think, come to in that model of what a university is for. And obviously, on the other side, what I imagine most of us are in this room for is to sort of defend. And on that, the vision, the best place to go for that vision, to privatise, is obviously, I don't need to tell you, to go to Lord Brown's report, because that is the perfect neoliberal jargon, because it tries to present itself as a very modern way of thinking about what universities are for. Universities matter because they transform the lives of individuals and drive innovation, and economic transformation is what Lord Browne says. But actually, then you read it, it's all about the marketisation of funding. And actually, what he really says, and these are quotes from the report, is that higher education is nothing to do with the thought, reflection, and so on that I've just been talking about. But according to Lord Browne, that it increases social mobility, reduces obesity, reduces depression, reduces poor health, and lowers the possibility of crime. And, of course, it relates to, quote, national prosperity. Those are the words from his report that has helped to shape the funding situation in this country. So what ought it to be? Well, I guess this is what the discussion is. I'm old-fashioned. I think it should be about a vehicle for addressing social inequality, developing thoughts, circulating knowledge, encouraging reflection, stimulating discovery, self-realization, stimulating social development. Now, there's a bit of a gap between those two visions, so we have to try and figure out a way of how to address that gap. But, you know, we have 2 days in which to do that, so it should be straightforward. So over to you for the next 45 minutes or so, and then everything you say, as I said, will be fed, regurgitated, and produced into a brilliant document. Harriet.
I'd just like to make a quick point which really backs up your dual vision. And it's quite interesting,